Hi everybody, very welcome to Mentour and yet another video podcast. As always, I hope you're doing absolutely fantastic. Today on the video, guys, we're going to be talking about the horizontal stabilizer on the 737-800. We're going to talk about what could happen to get that into position to force the aircraft to nosedive down towards the ground. I'm going to be showing you from the simulator how to deal with a runaway stabilizer and also discuss a little bit about how that could help you turn off the now infamous MCAS system. So stay tuned.
Wind 31016, everyone right, right on right. Third land, 31 right. Delta 260, Purdue.
This video is brought to you in cooperation with our long-term sponsor Brilliant.org. Now, do you know what the Coriolis effect is and what it does? Huh? Well, if you don't, and even if you do, I highly advise you to go in and check out Physics of Every Day. It's a course inside of Brilliant that will give you a lot of different information regarding this and many other things. If you want to improve your math skills and your physics skills in a fun and interactive way, then the 501st of you who uses this link here below will get 20% off their annual fee, but it's completely free to check it out.
Okay, if you can do that for me please on my training in disengage. Thank you. If it continues, I will go with the start spin instead of switches. Okay, let's evaluate this and see if it's moving.
Right, guys, so obviously during the last 2 weeks I have been basically flooded with questions about things like the Jackscrew, the stabilizer trim, the MCAS system, and how to deal with problems like this. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk a little bit about the pitch control of the 737, and we're also going to show you from the simulator how to deal with the runaway stabilizer and what that actually is. But the first thing we're going to do is look at the pitch control, okay? And then we're going to talk about some memory items that needs to be done in case you get a runaway stabilizer. So this is obviously not a 737, but it serves good as an example. In order to control an aircraft in pitch, you need to have, well, a couple of things. If you have a smaller aircraft like this, you basically only need the rudders at the back of the horizontal stabilizer, which are called elevators. Okay? So on a Cessna, for example, the wing is completely fixed, and then you have the elevators controlling the pitch at the back, and you have some small trim rudders at the back of the elevators. Okay. Now that works on a smaller aircraft, but if you are going to start flying a bigger, like an air transport category aircraft, well then, to have small trim rudders at the back of the elevators is just not enough. And that's because the bigger aircraft, like the 737, is operating within a huge speed range. So we're taking off at 140 knots, then we might be accelerating up to 320 knots, and then we could be, decelerating back again, putting out an enormous amount of flaps, and then landing at around 140, 150 knots again. In the meantime, you might have a rugby team that decides that they want to go to the toilet at the same time and start moving towards the back of the aircraft. So what I'm trying to say is that there's a much bigger trim requirement on a 737 than it is on a Cessna. So what is trim then? Well, like I was saying, if you want to pitch the aircraft up, we use the yoke in the cockpit and we pull that backwards, right? We want to climb, pull it backwards. When we do so, that is going to deflect the elevators up, and that's going to force the tail of the aircraft down and subsequently the nose of the aircraft up. Okay. Now, the thing with doing that is that if you want to maintain that, it means that you also need to maintain the same kind of pressure on the yoke. So if I'm going to be climbing up to our cruising altitude of 40,000 feet, I'm going to have to sit there like this. And if I'm also going to change my speed, that is going to have an impact on the trim. So I might have to sit with a lot of back pressure during this maneuver. Now, this is not good. If you're going to be flying, 12 hours a day, you will get some huge muscles from it, but it's not going to be comfortable. So we need to be able to trim those forces away. And the way that we do that in the 737 is that we move the entire back wing. So like I was saying, since you have bigger trim requirements, you need a bigger trim surface. And in the case of the 737, it's the whole stabilizer that's moving. You might have seen this if you've been boarding 737 from the back steps, that you can actually see that there's a little bit of margin to move. the horizontal stabilizer, and that's the stab trim movement. Okay. Now, the way that this is being moved is with the use of a jack screw. So, picture the stabilizer being attached to a giant screw. So it's like a nut, a wing nut that is attached to a giant screw. All right. Then you have an electrical engine that is moving the entire screw. That will mean that the little wing nut will move up and down. And this is what the stabilizer is doing. So we have this little electric engine, or quite big electric engine, that is turning the jack screw to move the stabilizer. Now we're using a jack screw because it's a great system. It moves in a very nice and controlled way. So there's no kind of jags in the movement. It's just moving smoothly up and down. And also, if we remove power to the electrical engine or to the manual engine, that means that the stabilizer stops in the position it had. All right, it is a self-locking mechanism. So those two things makes it perfect for the purpose of controlling the stabilizer. So that's the jack screw. And when you hear in the media that the jack screw was found to be in a position of nose down, this is what it means. If an accident investigation teams come to a crash site, when they look at the crash site, if they can find the jack screw, they can also see where the stabilizer, in this case the wing nut, is situated on the jack screw, and by seeing that they know exactly what kind of angle the back wing had, and that will tell them exactly if the stabilizer was trimmed to push the nose down or up. With me so far? Great. Okay, now whenever you have a system, an electrical system like that, or a movable system of any sort, it's not prone to, but it can have malfunctions. So this means that we need to have some kind of procedure if that malfunction happens. In the case of the stabilizer trim, it can be moved either by pilot input. So I have a little thumb switch that I move in order to activate the electrical trim that will move the stabilizer. So when I'm flying it manually and I am, like I was saying in the example, pushing backwards, then I will trim it backwards as well until the force is completely gone. So I don't need that back pressure anymore. And theoretically, I could at least momentarily release the control and it will continue to climb the same way. That's how we use it. We put it into the position we want and then we trim away the forces. Okay? Good. Now, if we actually have systems, believe it or not, even on the 737NG, which trims without pilot input. So even if I'm flying manually, if, for example, after takeoff, I'm not trimming out the aircraft. Let's say I'm taking off and I'm sitting there and I have the forces in. After a certain amount of time and within a certain amount of speed, there is a speed trim system. That's called speed trim system that starts trimming for me. But the thing to remember there is that the speed trim system, if I'm sitting there flying manually and the trim wheel starts to move, as long as it's helping me, if I'm feeling, this feels better, the speed trim system is doing it. But if I'm flying manually and I'm not doing any input and all of a sudden the trim wheel starts moving and it's starting to get heavy, well then I have a problem, all right? So that's what we would call a runaway stabilizer, or potentially a runaway stabilizer, all right? The same thing could happen with the autopilot disengage, because the autopilot is also controlling both the elevator to pitch the aircraft and the stabilizer trim to take away the forces. This is why when you're watching YouTube videos, for example, and you see the 737 YouTube videos, you'll see that that stab trim keeps moving all the time. All right, that's because when it's in autopilot, the autopilot is trimming the aircraft as well. That's completely normal. But these systems could falter, could have a problem with them. So if we find out, if I'm flying manual and this is happening, so it's now starting to trim the wrong way, I'm not inputting it, then we have to move very quickly. Now, I've been talking about something called the Quick Reference Handbook. That's the little manual that we have that contains all of the non-normal checklists for all of the different systems on board. Now, some of these checklists have something called memory items in them. And a memory item is something that needs to be done by the pilot by memory without taking the manual up. And that's because they're time critical. So that things like engine fire, severe damage and separation, for example, or runaway stabilizer. And it has to be done quickly because, as you can imagine, if you're flying and the stab trim is now starting to pitch the nose down towards the ground and you're struggling to keep the elevator because the elevator is much smaller surface than the whole stabilizer is, well then you have to get that stopped, because if it moves to full nose down, the elevator on the 737 is just not big enough to counteract that movement. There are aircraft like the 747, for example, that has huge elevators that could do that. But in the case of the 737, very hard, if not impossible. So we need to capture that quickly. So the memory items, and here comes the memory items, and you will see them in the video shortly as well. The first thing that comes up is I will tell the pilot monitoring to give me the memory items for the runaway stabilizer. And he or she will start reading it out. Number 1. Control column, hold firmly. Speaks for itself. Like if the trim is moving us down, I need to keep it back and you need to really hold it. Okay, and that can be quite tough. Number 2, autopilot, if engaged, disengaged. Okay, so disengaging the autopilot. The reason for that is that it might be a fault within the autopilot system that is trimming the aircraft. And hopefully, when we disconnect the autopilot, that will solve the problem. Right? Next point, auto throttle, if engaged, disengaged. Disengaged. Now we're flying completely manually, and there is good reason for that. Now the auto throttle system is not connected to the trim system, but if you remember my video from last week about how to deal with the stall on the 737, then remember that the 737 has underswung engines. So this means that anytime that you change the thrust, the aircraft will get either a pitch up, add thrust, or pitch down, and you reduce thrust. And this, since it's pitching up and down, means trim requirements. So the thrust could actually be used in order to get a little bit of help with the trim. So if I have a lot of nose forward trim in, and I add a bit of thrust, the engines are actually going to help me to keep the nose up. Obviously the speed is going to increase as well, but it is there. All right. Now at this point we're holding the control wheel. We have disconnected the autopilot and auto throttle. Now we evaluate. Has this solved the problem? If it has, good. Okay, then it was the autopilot. Continue fly manually and see if you can trim. If it hasn't controlled the problem, if the stabilizer trim is still moving now, well then the next point is stab trim cutoff switches to cut out. All right. This you've definitely heard in the media during the last few weeks. The stabilizer trim cutoff switches are 2 switches that are situated on the center part of the cockpit behind the thrust levers to the right of the engine start levers. Okay? And these 2 switches, if they're put to cut off, they basically remove all power from the electrical engine that's driving the jackscrew and the stabilizer. So if you put them to cut off, autopilot won't work, your normal thumb trim won't work, and other systems, like for example MCAS, won't work either. So that shuts off all of the external systems that might be influencing the stabilizer. So we put them to cut off, then we evaluate again, right? Did that work or not? Hopefully it did. If that worked, we still can trim the aircraft, but now we have to trim it manually, okay? The 737 is lovely in the way that they still have the good old wires connected. So if that happens, we just fall out a little handle on each side, on each trim wheel, and then we can move the trim wheel manually. So this takes a little practice. It's much slower than the normal electrical trim will be, but it's perfectly doable, okay? So we will just be trimming it manually, and that's it. Now, in an absolute worst case scenario where the stab trim cutoff switches are put to cut off, but the stab trim is still moving, well then we have one last memory item to do, and that is stabilizer trim wheel grasp and hold. And that is just as bad as it sounds. It means that you physically, one of you, pilot monitoring most probably, is going to have to take his or her hand and grab the stab trim and just physically stop it from moving. really bad, right? There are techniques to do this as well. If you have to do this, make sure that you're not trying to stop it close to you, because remember, if you're trying to grab it here, you only have your wrist and your wrist could break. So instead, go on the far side, because then you're going to have the full force of your arm to help you out. But that is a really bad day. This is a full-blown emergency. And talking about that, once we have done the memory items and the aircraft is fully under control, well, then it's time to talk to air traffic control. And if you have any kind of flight control problems, it generally is a mayday. If you've managed to stop the trim from running away and you can manually trim it, well, then it's more like a pan call, which is an urgency call. Okay? Things to do after that is going to include planning for the approach, because during the approach we're going to be starting to take flaps out and gear out, so we're changing the configuration of the aircraft, and that is changing the trim as well. So we're going to have to plan for how to trim that, manual trim, or if we can't trim at all, we might consider maybe not doing so big changes in configuration in order to not risk losing pitch control of the aircraft. But now let's have a look on how it might look if this would happen just after takeoff. So me and a colleague did this exercise yesterday. Now I want to emphasize that the video that you saw on my last episode, which was about how to deal with a stall, well, that was done as part of a new collection that I'm going to add to the Mentour Aviation app very soon. So it's professionally produced. This one I just had to take up my camera and film during the last part of a sim session yesterday. So you'll see that the quality is not the same. There's sometimes that it refocuses, but you'll get the gist of it. You'll definitely understand what's going on, so enjoy.
Thumbs up, no lights. Okay, after takeoff, check the space. After the checks, condition pressurization, steady, 1.5, set. Altimeter. Okay, we are QNH 1005 maintaining 3000 feet at the moment, as discussed before. 72. Can maintain keep and seated. Alright, so yeah. I am not doing that, okay? It's not me trimming. Okay, so it's okay. It seems to be trimming by itself, so state malfunction please. Seems runaway stabilizer. Okay, so I agree. It's getting quite heavy to hold it up here. So I'll take the runaway stabilizer memory items, please. Runaway stabilizer memory items. Control column, hold firmly. Yeah, holding firmly. Autopilot, disengage. Yeah, autopilot is disengaged. Auto throttle, disengage. Okay, if you can do that for me, please, I'm maintaining it. Disengage. Thank you. If it continues, I will go with the stop trim cutoff switches. Okay, let's evaluate this and see if it's still moving. Memory items for runaway stabilizer complete. Yeah, we'll just evaluate a little bit. I have no authority of the trim at the moment. Roger. Okay, so the fact that I can't control it manually means that it doesn't really work. So if you can continue with the memory items, please. Memory items, stop trim cutoff switches to cutoff. Continue. Cutoff. Okay, so now there's nothing happening at all when I'm trimming. Okay, so that's better. Can you please manually trim it backwards for me? Ready? Yeah, go ahead. Tell me when. Yeah, you're gonna need quite a lot. Okay. I'll help you. Okay, a little bit more. Okay, that's good. Okay. So it seems to be in trim. So I'm gonna keep, if you can give me 220 knots, please. Excellent. So much for you. Yeah, thank you very much. So I have it under control now. I can take the radio. Okay. And I'll take the runaway stabilizer, no normal checklist, please. Runaway stabilizer, no normal checklist. You're ready. And I keep keeping them trimmed since minor changes needed now. Runaway Stabilizer, no normal checklist. Ready for the condition. Go ahead. Condition. And command the stabilizer's movement, of course, continuously. We both agree.
Guys, that's all I had for today. I hope that made sense. I hope that explained a little bit more about things like the Jackscrew, the procedure to turn off the stabilizer trim if it's a runaway stabilizer caused by the autopilot or by a built-in system or indeed by the Jackscrew in itself. And I want to finish off by thanking the sponsor of this episode, which is Brilliant.org. Now, Brilliant.org has helped this channel a lot, okay? And I know that they can help you too, especially if you're struggling with maths and physics. They have things that I really like. For example, their daily problems that they send out. So if you're sitting on the subway or on your way to school, and instead of checking Facebook for the 5th time a day, you can go in and you can try to solve their daily problem. If you can't solve them, well, then there's a whole group of people there trying to solve it, so you can go in and watch the discussion or get some guidance from Brilliant in itself. Okay. Now, the 501st of you who uses this link here below will get 20% off the annual fee of Brilliant, and I really think that it's a good tool to use. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and if you have more questions about this, if you want to talk about flight control problems, or you want to talk about current events or anything, well, then get the Mentour Aviation app. You have the links to download it down here. It's completely free to download, and you can come in and you can discuss with me, and we're almost 5,000 people in there every day that's discussing all of the things that's going around. So just tag @Mentour, that will send me a message, or any of the other professional pilots or air traffic controllers or engineers that are in there. Have a great day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.